Welcome back, friends. It is a pleasure to be back on the mic with you. Today is an absolute banger episode. I've been wanting to put this one out for a long time. It's an episode that I have waited to put out because it's a little more deeper dive into everything you would ever need to know about protein. Protein is one of those biggest, most common topics that comes up in discussion around vegan diets, vegetarian diets, and specifically in relation to body composition. But you'll notice that, one of the first questions you ever get around, your diet is, how do you get your protein? What do you get your protein? As if it's this, big thing that everyone's deficient in. So I wanted to get on somebody who is a lot more in the know than I am, a protein researcher, someone who's actually been in the lab and researched these things, someone who is very knowledgeable and incredibly well respected in the evidence-based community. Today we have Eric Helms, and Eric Helms is what I like to think of as a bit of a godfather of evidence-based science communication. Eric, I'll give a bit of backstory. I first came across Eric years ago, back in the day when YouTube was just coming out, and Matt Ogus was huge at the time. If you don't know who Matt Ogus is, you probably weren't around in the early days of online fitness content, but Matt Ogus was a huge persona on YouTube, and he brought on a guy called Eric Helms, and Eric was probably lesser known at that stage, and Eric was actually Matt Ogus's coach leading up to one of his bodybuilding shows. And from there I sort of discovered Eric and 3DMJ, which is the coaching company that Eric co-founded and works as a coach alongside the other guys. And from there I sort of stumbled into this whole evidence-based fitness community, which I wasn't aware of before this time. Up until that point, it was just bodybuilding magazines and whatever I could find on bodybuilding.com, articles, things like that. And this introduced me to a whole new area of fitness that I'm so grateful I found, which means that I can be a bit more critical about what I put out in terms of content, what I read, what I give to my clients as recommendations. And Eric is a bit of a catalyst for that for myself. So it was a really big honor of mine, I guess, to bring Eric onto this podcast. And I've chatted to Eric multiple times before at conferences, specifically in Australia, and then bumped into him in the gym here in New Zealand as well. And always a quality individual who gives his time freely to anybody that wants to have a chat. And considering his notoriety and his status within the evidence-based community, I think that's a massive testament to his character and to his integrity. But Eric, he's a researcher, guys. He is a bodybuilding coach, powerlifting coach. He's competed in both of those sports. He is published multiple peer-reviewed articles on exercise science and nutrition. He has a PhD and a whole bunch of other qualifications that I won't ramble off at this stage. And he's a research fellow at AUT here in Auckland. Eric's also an author, and if you haven't picked up the Muscle and Strength Pyramid, be sure to do that if you want to dive deep into the science of strength, physique sports, and nutrition for body composition change. Those books are probably the most, in-depth and well thought out and well presented books on the topic, and I think you get take a lot away from those, as well as that he is part of MASS, which is Monthly Applications in Strength Sports, which is a research review that comes out monthly. So if you do want to dive into the research a little more, that is the one to go for. I subscribe to that myself, and it just allows me to easily break down a lot of the current research into a more digestible manner for specifically this community. So really good one there if you want to dive deeper into the science. But guys, without too much more rambling on, I do want to just say this is an episode you're going to absolutely love. This is going to be something I hope you will keep coming back to as kind of the sole protein sort of episode you'll need to listen to. This one has all the information you need to know to optimize your physique and your health, specifically in relation to protein. We cover protein targets for muscle growth, for dieting. We cover protein digestibility and amino acids and what specific ones we should be trying to aim for. We cover protein timing around workouts, whether you're training fasted, recommendations on BCAAs. All these types of things are discussed at length, along with a good discussion around protein and health, and whether a high protein intake may have downstream or negative downstream effects on longevity and all-cause mortality. So there's a lot in this discussion, guys. It's very in-depth, but please sit back, relax, grab yourself a protein shake. That would be very fitting for this episode, and I'll see you on the other side. You are listening to the Vegan Body Coach podcast, all about optimizing your strength, fitness, and physique through a plant-focused diet. My name is Jackson Burton, and I'm a nutrition and training coach for vegans, the plant-centric, and plant-curious. I'm sitting down with athletes, experts, and influencers around the world to inspire you to create your best vegan body yet. It is a pleasure to have you here, and I think it's been something I've wanted to do for a long time, is get you on here. And even though it's only been a short time this podcast has been in, to get you on and chat a little more in detail about specifically protein.
Sure.
Something that, within the vegetarian community is talked about like an incredible amount. I mean, more so than just the normal fitness. It's like the first thing that comes up every single time when I talk to anybody at like a dinner out or just chatting to anybody. It's always like protein. And I think a lot of the time we just overdo it and we go too far and too deep. But I think what I'd love to do with this episode is kind of break it down for people and almost create this as like the last protein episode they need to listen to. So they've got all the information they need. They can just go away and do it, and they know what's the most important things to be looking at and implementing in their days. Specifically, the people that listen to this podcast are more centered around optimizing body composition or performance or strength. But I do want to touch a little on the health side as well. But to kick us off, Eric, why don't you just sort of give us a quick rundown of sort of what you do so that the listeners kind of have a little bit of background. I will do a bit of an intro as well, but, maybe give us a little bit of detail there.
Absolutely. Well, first, just thanks for having me. And I think it's very respectful that you want this to be the final piece on protein.
Yeah.
But I will just put the small disclaimer that this probably shouldn't be the last thing you ever listen to and expect a definitive answer that's scientific, because good science updates itself, which is incredibly frustrating to people that want to know what's optimal today. But I do think there is many things that we are quite confident about in research. So we'll probably get to some at least big picture takeaways that we can be reasonably confident in, and informs our decisions. So who am I? I'm just a dude who likes lifting. And has kind of made that my obsession. So started lifting, 2004, and then became a personal trainer way too early after that, as most of us do. And then realized how little I knew and how ineffective I could be as a trainer. So I started looking at ways to get better. And fast forward to today, part of that process, I fell in love with lifting myself, and then found outlets for my competitive nature and just my drive to improve. So I got into drug-free bodybuilding as a competitor, powerlifting as a competitor, and then eventually as a coach for both, and then eventually as a researcher for both. So if we look at today in mid-2020, I am a research fellow at the Sports Performance Research Institute New Zealand at Auckland University of Technology here in Auckland, New Zealand. And I'm a research fellow that basically does research when I want, or I supervise master's and PhD students doing research in the areas of being a meathead, essentially.
Love it.
So that's what I do academically, but that's really only part-time. What I do most of the time, I act as the chief science officer. I like the way that sounds because it reminds me of Star Trek, to 3D Muscle Journey. So that is the company I started along with my 3 other colleagues back in 2009, where our goal was to support the drug-free lifting community with information, emotional support, coaching, the whole 9 yards, coverage, exposure. And now, we've got 3 full-time coaches. I used to be a full-time coach for a long time, and now I'm a very part-time coach with athletes I've been working with for a long time. And I make sure that we stay up to date with the best scientific information and coaching strategies to be effective. And I do a lot of science communication outside of that. So I have books. I have monthly applications in strength sport alongside Eric Trexler, Mike Zerdos, and Greg Nuckols. And I go on podcasts. I've got one of my own with Omar Isuf. And then, of course, we have the 3DMJ podcast, blogs, the whole 9 yards. So I basically just spend way too much time thinking about lifting.
Yeah.
And and in relevance to this podcast, I am someone who takes into account ethical considerations for when I eat. So I have been lacto-vegetarian at times, and now I'm more or less what I would call a flexitarian, which is amazing because there's the word flex in it.
Yep.
But for the most part, it just means that I attempt to minimize my consumption of animal products, especially with respect to what is humane and ethical. So it kind of looks like me being a pescatarian most of the time with not a whole lot of fish consumption. And when it is, it's something where I think it's line caught, et cetera.
Yeah.
And things that make sense for my moral compass.
Yeah.
So I thought a lot about the considerations of nutrition and the needs of athletes who are somewhere on that spectrum of eating for whatever reason to reduce their animal consumption, all the way from being vegan to saying you're vegetarian but you actually eat chicken. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think I wanted to get you on this podcast not just because of those. You do have some ethical considerations for how you eat, but because you are in the know and the research, and you've done it yourself, and you're a science communicator. And this podcast isn't just about getting on strictly vegans and vegetarians and staying in that sort of insular space. It's about branching out and getting people who know this stuff, but we can apply it to people that are choosing to, for whatever reason, whether it is moral, ethical, environmental, whatever.
And on that same topic, just so people know, I do publish research. I'm an active researcher, and my two areas that I'm most specialized in, because one was my master's thesis and the other was my PhD thesis. My master's thesis was on an applied topic in protein, so comparing moderate to high protein intakes in lifters and seeing their short-term to moderate-term responses. So I'm reasonably well read in the applied performance and body composition literature, and have done some data collection there.
For sure. Was that here in New Zealand you were doing that?
It was, yes.
Cool. I think a lot of people, and I didn't realize this either, that AUT, like where you're doing a lot of this research, it's quite a well-respected sort of institute for sports and performance around the world. Is that right?
Yeah, that's why I came out here. So I think at the time that I came out, it was, I would say, a rising figure in the world of strength conditioning, and it's only risen further. I think right now it's in the top 25 ranked schools specifically for sport and exercise science. So I mean that's what brought me out here. It's a cool structure. It's very non-hierarchical. It's very based on producing research and publications. And the cool thing about New Zealand, it's a heavily sporting interested society. It's very much ingrained into the culture. And because it's a small country that does invest in sport, that means that you can do pretty cool stuff. It's not as a wide, like people go, oh, but there's more money in the States. I'm like, yeah, but the money's being applied to things that are more population level. It's dispersed across a greater number of things, and it's harder to make connections between such a large field of people. So I think it's if you want to come in, do the research you want to do, and sports science is not that expensive, especially stuff I care about, and be able to do it effectively, it's a great location for it, which is what brought me here, and why we stayed, because we also just love the country. So,
Cool. Yeah, it's so interesting to me, because I consider you as sort of the like tippity top of like science communication. Like you're putting out so much stuff, and I've been following you for so many years, and then I bumped into you at NZ Muscle earlier this year at the gym there. And I'm like looking around, I'm like, yo, don't you guys know this is Eric Helms? Like, he knows stuff, man. Like, but it's so funny because people just don't know, and they're not in that sort of, I guess, possibly that really subset community of evidence-based, nutrition and fitness. And just a little backstory for the listeners, I think I came across you pretty early in the day, like back in, it might have been like 2011 or 2012 through Matt Ogus, which...
Yes.
I think like there was a post you put up recently, and all the comments were like, "Oh, I found Eric through Matt. And
Big time.
And I remember, I don't know, some video of you rolling around on a foam roller or something, and Matt was asking you questions, or like there was a few videos of you guys together, and I think that sort of, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sort of sparked the 3DMJ kind of rise and putting you guys out there as as sort of real knowledgeable heads in the industry. But it's just so funny how so many people actually came to that kind of evidence-based community through someone like Matt Ogus.
Yeah, that was the kind of the proto social media at the time. We were on Facebook, and really our awareness that it might be a good idea to get on YouTube was the crazy thing about it. He became one of our clients, and I was his head coach back in 2011. And he heard about us through somebody at the gym locally in Sacramento.
Wow.
So this is definitely that pre-awareness of 3DMJ as a thing. And then he asked me, hey, coach, do you mind if when I give you, instead of pictures for my mandatory poses that we're working on and assessment of your body composition changes towards the goal of getting on stage, do you mind if I send you just a YouTube video that's also on my channel? And I went, yeah, sure. Like, AKA what? And then when I get his report and it's, a summary of like multi-weeks of progress that he's putting on his YouTube channel that also has his posing for that week, it's got thousands of views. And we're talking in 2011. And I was like, what is going on?
Yeah.
So that's when I realized that, oh, wow, this very gifted, very hardworking athlete who I'm working with is also documenting this, and it's kind of the peak of that time period of what was views and fitness for YouTube.
Yeah. No, it was a good time. Cool, man. So should we jump into some protein, huh?
Absolutely.
Alrighty. So I guess, I want to break this down from the beginning with you, Eric, and sort of discuss some of the basics for the listeners. Probably starting with, why we should actually even look at increasing protein within the context of a diet for specifically performance or body composition goals. Why should we even care about increasing protein?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think nutritionally, I think the best way to look at it is that nutrition provides the permissive environment for you to produce effective gains in strength and hypertrophy. So that's really what I care about. So you say performance, I'm going to say strength.
Yep. That's pretty much what I mean.
Good. I mean, you could make an argument that protein's less important for shooting free throws or something like that.
Right. But there you go. Yeah, for sure.
So for example, protein is the building blocks of protein, of muscle protein. So like your muscle is built of proteins. Those proteins are built of essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. And if we are consuming insufficient protein, we can limit the rate of the accrual of muscle mass. And because strength, especially in the more restricted confines of how you express it, like if you were to do, if you were to throw a shot put, that's a little different. But if you're squatting, benching, leg pressing, there's a stronger relationship with just raw force production and that performance. So because protein influences hypertrophy and hypertrophy influences strength, you see pretty strong relationships. I was part of a meta-analysis. For those who don't know, a meta-analysis is kind of our highest quality of evidence in the sports science world. This is where we take all the small sample size studies on a topic that are difficult to make conclusions about, and if they're on the same topic and they're assessing similar variables, if there's sufficient homogeneity between them, meaning they're sufficient enough to be compared and on the same scale, we can analyze them all together and make some conclusions with a large sample size, so we're pretty confident in that conclusion. So meta-analysis led by Morton that I was a part of with a lot of other folks. It got published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and we found that right when you achieved about 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein per unit of body mass, that's when you start to see the peak rates of hypertrophy and also strength adaptations on average. And that's assuming the person is not in a calorie deficit and some other things that we used as exclusion criteria.
Right.
Now, we can only have a certain amount of confidence about any given population metric. So we have what's called a confidence interval. So if I say the 95% confidence interval, give me a little stats lesson here.
Yeah.
It ranges from here to here. That means I can be 95% confident the mean, the average response of what that protein level that maximizes those outcomes are in the real, true one actual average of everyone who that those populations represent. That's what it should represent. So that confidence interval actually ranged all the way from 1 gram per kg all the way up to 2.2 grams per kg or 1 gram per pound.
Okay, well.
So we made the argument that, hey, if your goal is to optimize the accrual of muscle mass, and given there's no seeming issue, which we'll talk about in terms of health, performance, or body composition of going a little too high, we recommend between 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kg. You can read that in the discussion. So for folks who are powerlifters, bodybuilders, Olympic weightlifters, strength athletes, or just really want to get maximally jacked or strong and they're recreational, I normally make a recommendation if they're not in a calorie deficit to be somewhere around that 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kg, just to make sure that they are not having protein being the limiting factor, the bottleneck to them advancing as quickly as they can in response to training.
Right. Cool. And so you did mention sort of essential and non-essential amino acids there. So those are kind of when we take a step down from protein, we're looking at amino acids, and they're the makeup of protein. So what is the difference between those essential and non-essential? Is it a case of all we need to focus on is the essential stuff?
Great question. So and this is for anyone who is maybe, it's been a while since they've had a nutrition class or got their personal trainer certification.
That's right, yeah.
But this applies beyond just essential amino acids. The term essential, when you're dealing with nutrition science, simply means that your body can't produce it in appreciable amounts on its own from other substrates. Our body is awesome. It's incredibly efficient, and it breaks down stuff all the time to make other things. So an essential amino acid is one that we need to ingest for us to be able to do that, to make it in sufficient amounts. So the essential amino acids are not only dependent on the diet, but they're also an intrinsic part of building muscle. If we were to not consume essential amino acids, we would be having to break down other tissues to get to those. And we'd kind of run into this problem of there's not enough supply to meet the demand. And we're like going to the recycling plant without ever replenishing it, if you will. So non-essential amino acids are things that are also abundant in the diet, but we don't necessarily need to be consuming them. They're typically not the rate-limiting step if we're to take it down another level. And some of the critiques, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, and you can take me in a different direction if you want.
That's good.
Some of the critiques of plant-based proteins, that they're typically compared to, say, whey and other animal-based products, even though they might be complete. An example would be soy. The proportion of them that is made up of essential amino acids is typically lower. So the quote-unquote protein quality, when you assess it from the essential amino acid content, and therefore what we think drives the synthesis of new proteins primarily, is that they're of slightly lower quality. So some people make the argument, hey, you want to be consuming mostly animal-based proteins, you want to be consuming mostly whey, and there's a lot of studies comparing like head-to-head whey versus soy, and soy has quote-unquote better outcomes in like a 16-hour study. We're talking about the actual raw muscle protein synthesis rate acutely. There are issues with extrapolating a 16-hour study to 24/7 daily life. And when you start to think about how much protein people consume throughout the day and the timing and kinetics of digestion, how long does it take you to digest things? Are there going to be these peaks and valleys? Is a study where you come in fasted overnight, do unfamiliar exercise, which causes an abnormal muscle damage response, which skews the muscle protein synthesis data, and then you only consume for that study either soy or whey in isolation without anything else. Does that actually represent or tell us much about the long-term response? There are issues with that. There's assumptions there. So there's typically a mismatch between short-term studies that assess the effectiveness, quote unquote, of a protein source on muscle protein synthesis and actual longitudinal outcomes when we say, hey, we're going to take this group of people and we're going to give them rice protein peri-workout, and this group we're going to give whey protein peri-workout on top of their normal diet. And that's when we start to see divergent outcomes in what we would expect based on those acute studies on protein quality.
That's cool. And I'd like to jump into sort of specific proteins that may be better choices for vegans and vegetarians a little further down the track. But I guess initially we've got those targets of, say, around 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight is a decent range to be in. Now, does that number change from what you've read in research, if there is a lot of research on this, I'm unsure, in regards to a purely plant-based diet?
I actually have not seen that to be the case. There's not a ton of good data on that, though. And I think this speaks to that large confidence interval I mentioned earlier, that once you're up in that range, man, like the differences between 1.6 to 2.2, they may be there, but the study you would need to detect those differences would need to be a high sample size over a long period of time with a high level of precision. You need to chuck them in an MRI. You'd need to really have a highly reliable data set. What that means is that even though there could possibly be a meaningful significant difference if we had a high enough sample size and a long enough study, it's probably not practically meaningful, So what do we do in that scenario? Do we spend millions of dollars and do a multi-site study that lasts years to try to find that, yes, over a 6-month period, you'll gain an additional 500 grams of lean body mass? Or do we just go, eat a little extra just to be safe because there's no downside?
Right.
Now, I think that's a fair argument. That's typically where I land, but that also there are things to consider depending on where you fall along that spectrum of plant-based. Because a pure vegan, if you tell them to eat 2.2 grams per kg of protein, that's going to drive up their carb intake. You know, it may drive up their total calorie intake, or it may require them to consume a whole heck of a lot of like protein supplements. And that may or may not be worth that cost-benefit ratio to them. If you're a meat eater, it's actually quite easy, or even a lacto-ovo vegetarian, to increase your protein intake. Eggs are cheap. You know,
sure.
You get a bunch of eggs, take out the yolks if you want. Yeah. Boom. You know, you've kicked up your protein 50 grams a day or something like that. You take a scoop away. Boom. You're at that 2.2 mark. But for a vegan or vegetarian, it might mean getting a protein supplement 2 or 3 times per day. So I think that's something worth considering, that you're either asking someone to consume a higher carb intake because most of the protein sources that are food-based in a vegan's diet also have other macronutrients in them. You know, people erroneously say like nuts, great source of protein. I'm like, no, nuts are a great source of fat, and they have some protein in them that's in isolation incomplete. You know, like, oh, if you combine rice and beans, complete protein. I'm like, yeah, but rice and beans are predominantly carbohydrate.
That's right.
So if you're eating nuts, rice and bean combinations, and you know, some tofu, and you're also consuming legumes, you know, like that's your typical vegan diet. If you want to get the 2.2 grams per kg of protein, you're probably at an obligatory 4 to 5 grams per kg of carbohydrate. And you're like, well, that's actually a lot. I'm not that active. Or let's say I'm at maintenance or I'm cutting right now. I can't do that. Well, you can either rock bottom and drop your fat, which is pretty easy on a vegan diet. But now you're at a really low fat, high carb, moderate protein diet, which is fine for a short-term period, but probably not long-term. Do you want to be on a low-fat diet? And then you go, okay, well, I can fix that. Maybe if I take some essential oils, like, all right, I'll buy these much more expensive algae-based EPA, DHA supplements, because that's what fish eat to actually have the essential fatty acids we're trying to get to. So now you're spending money on fish oil supplements, and you go, and the carbs are still a little too high. All right, and replace some of that with a protein powder. So you end up running in circles to some degree, and we're getting better and better and better at food engineering.
Right.
You know, like there's like Macro Mike's vegan like pancake powder and shit like that. Like there's a lot of solutions to this problem, but it's also difficult because a lot of the same people who are trying to eat vegan also don't want to eat engineered foods. So there are social decisions. There are people following the naturalistic fallacy. There's a lot of things where you have to almost, it's more useful to address this on an individual basis. I like to ask someone, so why do you want to eat this way? Because then I can understand what decisions they're likely to make. And potentially, if they're open to it, if they have certain beliefs that led them to be somewhere on that spectrum from omnivore to vegan, I can give them information that may help them be more accurate than that. If they're there for an ethical reason, I'm not going to like challenge their ethics. But if they have a false belief that a vegetarian diet is better for performance because they watched a Netflix documentary, or if they're under the false, or I'd say less nuanced belief, we can talk about health whenever you want, that a vegetarian diet is not because of covariates, but inherently more healthy than an omnivorous diet, then I might, if they're open to it, provide them information, because that can open more options to them. You know, if they're trying to be healthy, and I can tell them, hey, there's a way to do this. You don't have to be a vegetarian. Yeah. Then that gives them more dietary options, which is associated with a better relationship with food, you know, less of those logistical issues I talked to. You know, if they're doing it for performance, and I tell them, hey, I don't actually think there's strong evidence for a vegetarian diet being better for performance, again, more options are open. And if we can nail down what their specific ethical concern is it environmental, or is it the ethical treatment of animals, you know, then those can lead different areas too, because there may be ways that you can find certain companies or manufacturing processes that you feel comfortable with that ethical line in the sand, or with that environmental impact based on the best data we have. So that's the calculus that goes into my head as a coach. Yeah. Because I think a lot of people will often, as a science communicator, just be like, they'll put out information almost with a straw man a priori assumption. Like, you're a vegetarian because you think it's better for health. Don't you know it's not? Right. It may not be the case. Right. You know? So I think... That's very true. I think, and I've had that happen to me. Someone will ask me about what I eat, and that's why I don't talk about it a whole lot. Yeah. because they'll make an assumption. Even smart people I know, they'll make an assumption that I'm doing it for some reason. And I cock my head and then I'm like, do you really think I'm just didn't think about this?
Yeah.
Like I did this because of a meme, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
so.
for sure.
So anyway, I think there's a lot to go into the considerations around why one might be following a vegetarian diet, and that can lead down to different constraints on what you will include in your diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It's definitely interesting when I work with clients who've come to me who are vegan, and we'll chat about a lot of the times I'm eating really healthy, I'm eating whole foods and things like that, and like you were alluding to earlier, it doesn't always just equal weight loss, because if they're eating legumes, grains, and a whole bunch of nuts and, nut butters and coconut yogurt in every meal and things like this, I mean, the calories jump up real quick. Mm-hmm. So we have to start addressing some of that. And then it's interesting you brought up, like, this is one of my questions actually, is working around, hey, what are some recommendations for people that are in a fat loss phase for different macro splits? And I've been thinking about this a little bit recently when working with clients in more of an aggressive fat loss phase. I was like, hey, do we decide to pull back on carbohydrates, or do we decide to pull back on fats in order to keep, proteins high throughout the day? And I guess it comes down to what is the main protein source that you can, your protein from. If I've got a client who's in a bunch of soy, for example, having tofu and tempeh and edamame, it's a great protein source, and generally the fats are going to come up a little high with that, but it's going to be lower in carbohydrates. Whereas if we go the other way, we're going to have a higher grain and legume-based diet. The carbs are going to come way up, but the fats will be nice and low. So I guess a lot of it's going to come down to personal preference. Mm-hmm. But do you have any recommendations for people which would be better one way or the other, based off your experience working with people in quite long-term fat loss phases?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time, especially in the bodybuilding community, even when the clients aren't bodybuilders, but the trainers are, their attention goes to what is optimal from a physiological perspective. Like they want to know, what about the hormones, or what about performance? And I think when it really comes down to it, the biggest factor here when you're talking about weight loss is going to be their ability to stay on that diet without being hungry or without feeling so restricted. So that is going to be something that has a lot to do with personal preference. And we can be informed by some research that has to do with dietary restraint and has to do with satiety and hunger. So protein is, I would say, on a gram per gram basis as a macronutrient, the most satiating of the three macronutrients. But you don't eat protein, you eat foods, right? Mm. And when you look at what is the most satiating diet, it is typically either a ketogenic diet, where the carbs are really low, which is super prohibitive for someone who's a vegan. Like a ketogenic vegan diet is, you can fit the whole diet on a piece of paper. Yeah, like that's not good. It's like a sticky note, yeah. And it is you're making a trade-off there. You are saying, all right, I'm happy with having a higher baseline level of satiety and lower level of hunger, but having less food options and being more restrained and having a higher element of rigid restraint, which might predict a lack of success. And that might depend on whether you're a moderator or a restrainer, but it's certainly not a long-term solution. And I think it's really restrictive for someone who's also plant-based. Right. So in my opinion, so that's one angle. The other angle is that when you look at basically habitual intakes of food, one of the things that will predict a lower habitual intake of food, so you're not trying to restrain yourself, is what's called the energy index, or I should say like the volumetrics of it, right? Which is the how much calories are per unit of food, right? So the energy density, that's the word I was looking for. So the energy density is going to be lower in foods that are higher in water content and that are higher in non-digestible fiber. So essentially, diets that are really rich in foods that you chew, they distend your stomach, which has a cascading effect on appetite-stimulating hormones. Yep. You eat a ton of fruits and vegetables and, a lot of fibrous foods. That is typically associated with eating less total food. You eat a similar weight of food, but a lower calories. And that is predominantly going to be carbohydrate-based foods, plants and vegetables. Right. So that's why vegetarian diets often seem to result in weight loss, in my opinion, even though you might see a lower total protein intake on average in vegetarians versus non-vegetarians. That kind of shows that the difference between like 1.2 grams per kg of protein compared to 1.8 grams per kg of protein, that is less probably hunger stimulation. Appetite stimulation, I would imagine, but it's probably subsumed by the fact that you have such a high fiber diet, such a high, low energy density and high volume of foods with a low energy content. So I would typically recommend someone follow a heavy intake of fruits and vegetables, minimize their fats, and then have a supplemental protein source, like say a pea protein or something like that is my default setting for someone cutting. And then if they were vegan or vegetarian and necessarily drop their fats really low, I would just do it in cycles. So we'll go, hey, we're going to take a 4 to 8 week fat loss phase here. Then, we could have like a diet break in the middle of a week. And then when we come back into it, we'll just kind of add fats back in, add carbs a little bit. And that might remove the requirement to have as much supplemental protein so that all of a sudden the diet becomes less restrictive. And I think on balance, when you compare, say, like a ketogenic vegetarian diet to what I described, which is just kind of eliminating the oils and the fats and the nut butters and, not going crazy on avocado, and then adding a shake or two of pea protein, for example, that's going to feel less restrictive in terms of total number of food options, but they will both be highly satiating. And while you could make an argument that you can get in a whole lot of vegetables and just limit your fruit intake and go keto, I think on net balance of what's more likely to provide, fewer nutrients, going almost no fat could be problematic for the low fat approach, which is why I'd say do it in phases, which also gives someone an opportunity to practice maintenance. It's not just I'm going to lose a lot of weight for 4 weeks and then gain it all back, which is what 90% of people unfortunately do. But it forces the trainer, it forces the person to take this phasic approach where now they have to go back to, okay, I'm going to take what I learned and bring it into life. I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to learn to maintain it instead of just repeatedly losing that same 30 pounds over and over and over again.
That's right.
Until they give up. So I think that's the approach I would take.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's something I work on a lot with our fatless clients is like, hey, when we exit, like what is our exit plan? What are we going to do after this diet? And it's trying to establish those eating patterns that just are just habitual patterns that lead to long-term weight maintenance. And we tend to get reasonably good results with our guys because we set that up as a initial thing. It's like, hey, once this is done, like I still want to see you, following some kind of plan that's going to slowly bring you out of this sort of more accurate phase of whether it's tracking or whatever it may be. When we talk about sort of cutting and massing, is there a change in the target of protein between those two? Are we seeing, in a fat loss phase, are we going to try and maybe target to higher end of the 2.2 grams per kilo just due to satiety effects or possibly due to an increase in muscle retention during that time? Or can we say in a cutting phase, drop it down like lower if someone was at 1.6 or something or 1.5 or 1.4, and maybe that way they can bring up their carbohydrate intake a little bit and help themselves with a bit more food diversity and satiety and ensuring they're getting micronutrients and things like that. Yeah,
that's a great question. And I think the question is easier to answer for omnivores. I think it's easier to get a high protein intake in without sacrificing too much in terms of kind of cornering yourself as far as your other macronutrient and food options. When you're a vegan, there is a trade-off. But I would say that if anything, I'll phrase it this way. My master's thesis, which I alluded to earlier, I started with the hypothesis that a higher protein diet would be more protective of lean body mass losses and would lead to better outcomes. And I don't think I had a study that was set up to detect that was only 2 weeks long. And again, we're looking at these small differences that I alluded to earlier. We did see less diet-related stress and less total stress in the higher protein group, 2.8 grams per kg versus 1.6 grams per kg in that in that specific study. And there is data to suggest somewhere around 1.8 grams per kg and higher is where satiety starts to maybe level off. And then maybe at very high protein intakes, it can get bumped again if you look at some of Jose Antonio's work where they're giving people just a crap ton away.
Yep.
But those weren't during dieting periods. It was almost like that huge amount of protein forced them into a small deficit.
Right.
And I think it was just like, God, I'm just so tired of drinking whey shakes.
Yeah,
And other places turned into eating a little bit less. So I don't know how translatable that is. So for an omnivore, yeah, I would say probably try to get at least 2.2 grams per kg of protein. And that shouldn't limit your ability to have lots of fruit, lots of veg, drop your fat a little bit, reduce your digestible carbohydrate down a bit,
right.
And have on net balance probably the best diet in terms of sustainability. I do think there is a mechanistic rationale for, especially in leaner individuals, a higher protein intake potentially being better. We don't have long-term data that support it, so I'm open to changing my mind.
Yeah.
But it may be that a higher protein intake would help people retain muscle better. So for example, the main mechanism by which we lose muscle mass when dieting is that muscle protein synthesis comes down. So the ceiling drops a little bit, unfortunately, to how far we can bump it up. High protein diets, which includes the moderate protein intakes I've mentioned, not like crazy high.
Right.
And then resistance training bumps that back up and helps us not lose muscle. But on net balance, most people do lose muscle when they diet if they're not with obesity. So when we see leaner individuals, they're more likely to lose lean body mass. So what the heck's going on there? Well, there is some data to suggest that if someone is not with obesity, if they're not overweight, if they have less fat mass on their body, that we also see an increase in muscle protein breakdown. So the net result of whether or not you're gaining or retaining muscle in this case is the balance between breakdown and synthesis. Mm-hmm. So leaner people, and this makes sense because now they have less fat mass to tap into, you're going to see muscle protein breakdown go up, which is utilizing potentially skeletal muscle mass to account for the energy deficit and the fact that there is not adipose tissue to tap into. So leaner people are kind of getting hit on both ends. And this goes along with anecdotal, experience and data, observational data, I should say, where more lean body mass is lost in leaner competitors. They seem to lose more lean body mass. It may be required to get to that point. And again, it seems like there is typically more lean body mass losses in lean rather than obese people in general, or people with obesity, I should say. So if there's a higher muscle protein breakdown and a higher muscle protein synthesis, that means the body is looking to rely on protein a little more. So we probably want to supply that in the diet rather than going, I have my quadricep.
Right.
But that's a mechanistic argument, right? We need longer term studies before we can really say that we have the agency to overcome that by even higher protein diets than we see are effective at maintenance or in a surplus. Because I would say that there's not, there's nothing wrong with someone going, I'm just going to eat 1.6 grams per kg. And I go, you could be one of the people who might do better with more. I can't know that, but the difference wouldn't be huge. All good.
Yeah.
But when someone is in a diet, I think there's a chance they could get better satiety, and there's a chance it might make a meaningful difference in terms of lean body mass retention. I can't know that not to be the case yet. It matches my anecdotal experience, and there's a theoretical rationale, and there's some observational data, but there's no data going the other way. So on net balance, the evidence-based decision would be, let's try to get that protein up. But with the vegan, there's a cost, just right. Like you said. And I think that comes down to the individual calculus. Like, how do they feel? How many protein shakes does that require? Do you feel satiated on a big pea protein shake? For anyone listening who's never had pea protein, it's actually a lot more satiating than whey.
That's right.
It bulks up. It's it takes up a lot of space. It's hard to drink. That's actually the protein type we used in my study for my master's. We did it for blinding reasons because most people haven't taken pea protein, and this also was back in 2013. So in 2013, it was even rarer.
Yeah.
This is 7 years ago before the vegan craze really hit, especially in here in New Zealand.
Big time.
So a lot of people anecdotally were experiencing when they were on the higher protein arm of the crossover. It was basically we had a low flavor profile maltodextrin mixed with some pea protein or just straight pea protein. So they're getting like 70 grams of maltodextrin, 20 grams of protein, or just 90 grams of protein from throughout the day.
Yeah.
And the people on the protein diet, and it matched the data. If you look at their daily analysis of life demands of athletes and the profile of mood states, they were struggling to get all the protein down. Yeah, they still felt terrible overall in both groups, but they felt less terrible, and specifically on the diet item on the DALDA in the group that was consuming 90 grams of protein.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? I think it's very individual. Yeah. I would try to find a way to get their protein above that 2 gram per kg mark in a vegan. only so long as when you sat down and looked at their sample meal plan and what they're eating in a day, it didn't wipe out a whole bunch of their options and sources, didn't drop their fiber, didn't drop their total vegetable count, etc. So yeah, I think there's more logistical concerns when you have fewer food options available to you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, in these days too, the pea and rice proteins are getting much better too.
Yes,
so.
They are. They taste good now.
Yeah. It's not as difficult. I mean, I know the first time I tried to drink one after being hooked on whey protein for 5+ years, it was like gagging trying to get it down. But now it's it's just the normal thing for me, and they taste really good. But still in a cut, I do get very sick of having 3 shakes a day and whatnot. So I have to do some juggling around of different macronutrients to ensure I'm getting more of it from whole foods if I can, which ideally is the goal anyway, because obviously of the micronutrient density of those as well. Mm-hmm. But Eric, you did talk a little bit about combining beans and rice before, and this is something I want to cover, is because this is something that's, I guess, a little bit of controversy around in terms of the combining myth, or whether that is a myth or not, and that do vegans need to combine protein sources within a meal to hit a complete amino acid profile for that meal, or is there validity to just having a set total daily protein intake and going for that, as opposed to like, hey, I'm only having wheat protein here, I need to add in some from soy or something like that? Yeah,
this is one of those examples where truth is taken and then extrapolated to an unknown timeline.
Right.
And I would argue an illogical timeline. So it is true that, I'll back up, we have complete and incomplete sources of protein. And this is just based on whether or not they have the full complement of essential amino acids. Because we talked about before, for the body to get everything it needs, you need to be consuming in your diet essential amino acids. So a lot of plant-based sources like rice, beans, etc., don't have the full complement of essential amino acids. So quote-unquote complementary proteins like beans and rice, between them, their powers combined, they are Captain Planet with essential amino acids, right? Yeah. So that is true. But that's therefore been extrapolated to say, okay, on a per meal basis, you can't just have rice or beans, or when you have rice at lunch without beans, your bicep's going to get used. And it's like,
that's right.
Like, it's true. We don't have a storage location for, like, the amino acid pool is us.
Right.
It's not like, liver glycogen and muscle glycogen or adipose tissue, where we have this abundant supply of carbohydrates and fat. It's going to get pulled from us, but it's more like a bank account. It's not like, oh shit, at lunch I used some of my amino acid pool, there goes my bicep. It's like you're constantly gaining and losing protein, and it's the net outcome that matters. And where was there a stimulus to maintain it?
Right.
So if you're lifting weights with eventually hitting everything full body in the course of your training cycle, there's going to be a net stimulus for higher protein synthesis and therefore deposition of muscle proteins into those muscle groups, which should be everything, right? That you're training. And that means, okay, you had rice at lunch and no beans, no big deal. It really has to do with, okay, what timeline do we deem it acceptable to have complementary proteins? And I see no reason that we need to worry about lunch. I think we can absolutely worry about the diet as a whole. I'm not even sure it matters in 24 hours. It could matter in 48. I don't know, but I do think it's unreasonable to put that restriction or emphasis on a per meal basis. So I think it's more appropriate to look at, if we were to just draw a line in the sand that was probably more based in our understanding of the body, on a per meal day or per day basis rather than per meal, just because it's more logistically feasible. So if throughout the day you had a mixed sources of vegetable-based proteins, you're fine.
Yeah. Would that change though if we are trying to target leucine threshold per meal? So if we're talking more specifically back, hey, I'm working with someone who wants to get maximally jacked, what can we do to maximize that? And leucine is often one that comes up.
Perfect. So leucine, one of the essential amino acids, and also a quote-unquote special one of the essential amino acids that seems to be kind of the ignition key for the process of protein synthesis. If you think of leucine as the key that goes in the car, you can think of the fuel tank as the essential amino acids. But in reality, it's more like a hybrid car with a solar panel. So we also are able to convert a lot of things into non-essential amino acids. So while the essential amino acids are essential for building muscle, the muscle building process also includes non-essential amino acids. And if you're consuming insufficient protein, then we have to get those from somewhere. We can make them, but there's a cost. That means some other place of protein in our body is being pulled from. So we have to consider not only leucine, but also our total protein content and our total essential amino acid content. If we think of that kind of analogy of key, gas tank, and solar panel, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
So the car won't run at all without gas, but it can get the non-essential amino acids from the solar panel, and the car won't start unless you have leucine. That's a roughly accurate analogy that I'm comfortable with using. So if your goal is to maximize muscle protein synthesis, we also need to understand that this car it seems to only be able to turn on and go at max speed once every 3 to 4 hours. So there's what's called a refractory response to protein. So if you were to give someone a massive hit of protein right now, and you've done this in the lab, and then do it again, you won't see a subsequent spike. It has to kind of fall back to baseline. It's called the muscle full effect. And this makes sense. If we had runaway synthesis of protein, we'd turn into the Akira monster, and some kind of goo-based muscle beast, which sounds pretty awesome now that I talk about it. So maybe we need to work on that.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's some rate limiting steps so that there's feed forward and feed backward effects. There's loops, negative and positive feedback loops in the body, and this is one of them. Where if you supply enough protein, it does its thing, and I'm not going to do that again until a sufficient time has passed.
Right.
So anyway, that means that theoretically, what would maximize muscle protein synthesis is getting a total sufficient amount of sun and gas, but also making sure we turn that key roughly evenly spread throughout the day.
Yeah.
And there is some mechanistic data, the short-term kind of stuff, where they have compared an 80-gram dose of protein in 3 different delivery methods. So they came in fasted, again, like we've talked about, and then gave them either 1 hit of 80, 2 hits of 40, or what is it? 4 hits of 20.
Right.
And the group that did 4 hits of 20 had greater area under the curve for muscle protein synthesis because they were avoiding that refractory period, hypothetically.
Yes.
Now, the problem with that study is they came in fasted overnight and only consumed 80 grams of protein.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. People are consuming not only way more protein than that in the scenario we're talking about, but also carbohydrates and fat. So that changes what that response looked like. So whey protein is the fasted digested protein. It gets in and does its thing in 30 minutes. If we look at, say, a steak, that for a 25-gram protein steak, which is half the size of steak you'd get at a restaurant in most cases, that takes at least 6 hours to fully incorporate and to see your plasma levels of amino acids go up. And that's how do I know it's at least 6 hours? Because the study only lasted 6 hours. It could have been longer.
Right, yeah.
An omelet is roughly 8 hours, right?
Wow.
And that's not just, I'm using animal-based examples because I know that data, but I also know that plant-based proteins take a long time as well. So whey shortens that window. It creates those peaks and therefore creates the valleys. The lack of carbohydrate, the lack of fiber, and the lack of lipids, fat, also creates those valleys because all of those things delay gastric emptying.
Right.
So what that means is that in a real world scenario, and we have some data on this where when you're comparing taking protein supplements with meals or protein supplements between meals, there was a systematic review that found no difference in outcomes as far as lean body mass accrual when they're supplementing people. They looked at a bunch of studies. Okay, are you going to take them with meals or between? Because this should tell us something about protein spacing. If you're doing it between meals, we should have a more even spread of protein intake. That group should be better. If you're taking them with meals, then we have a suboptimal spread, right?
Yeah.
We're oversaturating leucine, supposedly,
right,
and then going too long of a period where we could have saturated again and then oversaturating again.
Yep.
So theoretically, taking protein with meals, if you're having your standard Western 3-meal-a-day thing, should be inferior to having your 3 meals with 2 or 3 spacings of protein supplements between it.
Right.
But that doesn't happen in the real world. And that's probably because you've got, as I like to say, like a conga line in your digestive tract. If you're consuming a mixed meal with 40 grams of protein and, say, 80 grams of carbohydrate, 10 grams of fiber, and 10 grams of fat, you're going to be digesting that for 10 hours.
Right, yeah.
You do that 3 times in a day, you're almost always in what's called a postprandial state.
Yeah.
And the digestive state. The only time that might not be true is first thing when you wake up in the morning, depending on when you had dinner and whether you had a snack before bed or not. So yeah, if you eat at say let's say 8 a.m., noon, and then 6 p.m., you can make an argument that sometime around 5 a.m., 2 hours before you wake up, yeah, you are actually in a comparable state to those that study. And you could have another protein hit there or something like that.
Right.
Hence the argument for like casein before bed or something like that. But when it comes to the real world situations, the leucine trigger, muscle-full effect, protein bolus spacing kind of hypotheses, they probably do make a difference, but not to the same degree we think. So I would say anytime you're getting at least 3 servings or more per day and roughly spreading out protein, it probably won't make any difference because those peaks and valleys are going to be stepping all over each other.
That's right. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So it's almost like it's all sort of like converging over the day. And if I was to have, try to get 6 meals of evenly spaced protein, it's probably not any more optimal than just say having, 3 good meals of protein in a day.
Yep.
Probably just not going as far down the line as saying, hey, I'm just going to have 1 protein hit.
Yeah. And I think when you look, and some indirect evidence in support of this is, so there was a intermittent fasting, probably more accurately termed time-restricted feeding study, I think done by Tinsley and colleagues. I could be wrong. They might have done the other one I'm going to refer to. But there's 2 ones I'm thinking of. One has a 4-hour feeding window, and one has an 8-hour feeding window. In the 4-hour feeding window, they had to get all their protein and meals in that 4-hour feeding window, and they saw poorer lean body mass outcomes than a group that was not being time restricted. But when you go to 8 hours, you can get 3 protein servings in 8 hours, and there was not a significant difference.
Right.
So there is some point where if you restrict the timing enough, it can be problematic. I think we'd agree eating every other day would probably lead to a little more lean body mass losses. Because even eating only 4 hours per day led to more lean body mass issues. So that feeding window doesn't need to be huge. Most people eat in like a 10 to 13 hour window throughout the day.
Yeah.
So going to 8 hours, it's not that big of a difference, compared to what people normally do. And there's a whole bunch of anecdotal experience to support that. People have used intermittent fasting as a tool to manage their hunger. There's issues with that, which we won't get into, but it is indirect evidence that the super OCD management of protein timing is probably not going to make a huge difference if chopping 4 hours off of your feeding window doesn't make a difference the other way.
Yeah, for sure. As a little side tangent, you just got me thinking about like 36-hour fast periods. And I've used this with a couple of clients before just to, basically create a nice weekly deficit for them. And, it seems that after the first day or the first few hours or whatever, hunger tends to just switch off anyway and they can kind of cruise through it. But in terms of muscle retention, do you have any ideas or any thoughts on how much, you probably can't put a number on how much muscle you would lose, but what the risk of muscle loss is for a 36-hour period without a protein feeding?
I think this comes down to a cost-benefit analysis, right?
Yeah.
So if you have someone who is... this could turn into a whole other podcast.
Yeah, it could.
So here's the things I would think of from a trainer's perspective. Are you a bodybuilder? Probably not, or this wouldn't even be on the cards for you. Mm-hmm. You'll find no bodybuilders who do like fasting.
That's right.
That's because their absolute explicit goal is the thing we're talking about risking.
That's right.
So the cost-benefit analysis for them is that's off the table. The maybe intermittent fasting with an 8-hour window, but 36 hours, absolutely not.
Not gonna.
But it is true. There is data showing that when you go for a long enough period fasting, hunger gets blunted. That's actually an adaptive thing that makes sense. And there is potential utility for that, but it also creates restriction and it only lasts so long. You're going to get hungry if you don't eat. That's just the way it is. I think everyone knows that to be true. But there is a threshold where the body goes, you really aren't going to eat, are you? Okay, I'll switch this off for now. But then you're going to get low blood sugar. You're going to feel shitty. It's going to affect your sleep. Things are going to happen eventually. So if it's someone who just wants to lose predominantly fat, yeah, you get them to do resistance training 3 times a week. And on the days when they do eat sufficient protein. If they're of a low training experience and therefore a low threshold for inducing hypertrophy, the same way we maintain muscle is the same way we grow muscle. We're just fighting growth and breakdown all the time.
Right.
So the program to maintain maximal muscle is the same program to gain maximal muscle from what you do in the gym perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? So if you're doing everything to induce hypertrophy in this person and they just have a 36-hour window, it's the question of how much they're gaining versus how much they're losing. And for someone who's just walked into the gym first time training, that's probably still going to be in their favor. And they're not coming to you to go, hey, I want to lose fat while gaining maximum muscle. They want to come to you to change their waistline. So even no change in muscle mass and a loss in body fat would produce some really good visual effects.
100%.
However, I would say that if the only way you can find success with this person is a 36-hour fasting window, how sustainable is that? You know, so it's an easy way to create a deficit. But if you're not changing the behavior on the other 5.5 days during the week, then they're just going to go back to whatever got them there in the first place.
That's right. Yeah.
So again, that's the short take of that second podcast we could do.
No, that's a great point. I love it. Well, do you want to give us a couple of recommendations on protein feedings around workouts? I think one of the big ones that I've had some discussions with, and I think I brought this up as a question for a couple of the guys at the UABC last year, was around pre-workout fasted protein, and if that is required, or we can get away with just having a bolus post-workout and not have to tap too much into, you know, muscle protein breakdown, or whether we can sort of even that out a little bit, or so what are your thoughts on sort of protein around fasted training?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time I don't think you need to be fasted for training. If someone's training fasted, I normally ask them why, and there's often some misconception they have. Or simply, they're training before work and they don't want to eat at 5 a.m.
Yeah, most of our guys who are morning trainers here, everyone starts at 5:30, so very few of them are eating before. Yeah.
So I think therefore we're thinking about, okay, how are you going to perform? Because your ability to perform in a resistance training session is indirectly going to result in how much muscle mass you retain. How much of a tension stimulus can you supply? So if your performance is hurt, you're going to get a less efficient stimulus. So then we think, okay, well, how much does feeding matter for training for hypertrophy? And not that much, but it does something. So there was a study that just recently came out by Naharudin and colleagues, and it's a follow-up study of their previous one where they compared just having water or breakfast before training, and they found people were getting more total reps on squat and bench when they had breakfast. They did a follow-up where they compared a semi-viscous, almost yogurty-like substance that was basically kind of like guar gum, and like it's gross. Like they actually rated it as less palatable and enjoyable than water. So that just tells you what they had. But it's like this orange sludge they gave them that provided 1.5 grams per kg of carbohydrate 2 hours prior to training, or a placebo, which was orange flavoring, similar consistency, pulp, and then artificial sweetener.
Gotcha.
So both the placebo and the actual carb-based meal performed better than the group that had just water. So could be just a placebo effect. Could also just be that hunger has some downstream effects in terms of signaling or just distraction that leads to poor performance.
Right.
And there is data showing like longer term endurance training is negatively affected if you don't consume carbohydrates or food in general before training. So you probably want to have something. You don't want to go into training hungry, and you'll probably perform a little better. So that could be, a scoop of whey. That could be just a Quest bar as you walk out the door. That could be half a banana. It doesn't take much. In fact, it seems like almost anything will be better than nothing. So the question is really not, do I need to have a pre-workout meal? It's like, what can I take that makes me feel a little better, doesn't negatively affect me at all?
Yeah.
It could be protein. Doesn't have to be. And I don't know of any data that convinces me that a pre-workout protein bolus, even when fasted, is better than a post-workout protein bolus. It's just that it could be taken pre-workout to fulfill the need of having something and not feeling hungry and having a diminishing effect on performance. And then you could either or not, or also have protein post-workout, so long as your total intake for the day is sufficient.
Yeah, so we're not talking about breaking down tons of muscle mass just because we only had about half a banana instead of a protein shake, pre-workout.
It's a bank account, right? So even though you've been fasted for that long, I don't think that's a sufficient enough issue for that, with that analogy of it being a bank account of withdrawal and deposits, and the net effect being what you care about. So I think even if you haven't eaten for 10 hours, you train so long as you had a half a banana and your performance is good, any quote unquote catabolic effect will then be that withdrawal will be compensated for if you're getting sufficient total daily intake, even if that starts with a 40 gram pea protein shake, and once you're now at the 9 hour mark of not eating or whatever it is instead of 8 post workout. I we don't have any data to suggest that's not sufficient.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's an interesting discussion, especially with that study with the placebo. I mean, even for myself, when I train fasted, I'll have a caffeinated pre-workout drink beforehand. And maybe that is just that placebo effect giving me the sensation of I've had something. You know, I'm no longer in that sort of hunger state. I've drunk something. It tastes sweet.
And caffeine can actually...
And caffeine, exactly.
Yeah, so the caffeine can actually acutely suppress hunger.
Yep.
So that could be part of it, you know, or it's that you're getting an ergogenic effect from caffeine that counteracts what would normally be an ergolytic or performance detriment effect of not eating at all. So there's a few more things going on there.
Yeah.
And we're still trying to figure out what's going on with carbohydrate-based meals and their the short-term impact. Is it the sweet sensing or is it the carbohydrate sensing in the mouth? How much of an impact does that have?
Yeah.
So, and it doesn't take much. Like most data does not show a benefit of mouth rinsing, carbohydrates, and resistance training.
Okay. Some
do. And they're typically the ones where more volume is done, more total exhaustion is done. But we're talking about swishing 6 grams of carbohydrates per the solution, you know, concentration in your mouth and spitting it out.
Yeah.
And then artificial sweetener not having an effect. So what's going on there, right? Is it just sweetness? It probably might be something to do with carbohydrate sensing. And it's more effective for endurance training. So there is a mechanism. Yeah. It just doesn't often end up being the thing that influences performance when we're talking about lifting.
So can we throw out branched chain amino acids intra-workout, pre-workout at all? Or I know that I've gone through stages of going hard on BCAAs and then going, oh no, the research doesn't support it. I won't recommend it anymore. I won't take it. And then going, oh no, maybe there is certain circumstances where I can take it. Potentially if I'm having a super low protein meal and I could add a branched chain amino acid supplement to that. Or, for example, if I have a client who is doing intermittent fasting and they have to train morning fasted, but then they don't want to eat till 1 p.m., maybe I could give them a branched chain amino acid supplement to sip on during the morning. Do you think there's any sort of, founded research to support that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think normally I would have I'd say I have a less nuanced answer if we weren't talking about people who are potentially vegans.
Yeah. I think that's where it gets interesting.
Any argument for branched chain amino acids is the same argument for just having a scoop of whey.
Yep.
Right? Mm-hmm. And then you're just like, well, even whey isolate is cheaper than branched chain amino acids. So, do you just like to lose money? Yeah. I mean, but there's even a more nuanced argument on this topic. So if whey is not an option, then okay, you actually consider it. But the more nuanced thing is we have to admit that branched chain amino acids, there are only 3 of the 9 essential amino acids. So we run into some problem. We need we got the trigger, but you typically don't see as high of MPS rates in some of the studies that compare these things head to head, because to get all of the other amino acids that are involved in muscle protein synthesis, non-essential and essential, that are not the branched chain amino acids, we have to pull from ourselves. So we run into that recycling. Yeah. We run into that trying to make things from a recycling factory, but not actually putting more stuff into the recycler problem eventually.
Yeah.
So, but that only would apply if your whole diet was branched chain amino acids, and there have been studies on that. But anyway, the point being is there is probably a better argument if you were a vegan to get an essential amino acid supplement than branched chain amino acids, which are out there. They're not as popular because fucking BCAAs have this cultural thing in the bodybuilding community, especially. And that largely came from back in the day with the bodybuilding.com forums and them being sold, and a lot of people going, these are awesome.
Yeah.
And not really being able to, how do you know that?
Yeah.
You're consuming 300 grams of protein per day and taking BCAA and you're getting better outcomes. How do you tell?
Yeah.
And then the one study that might sort of suggest it, it's actually a multi-ingredient supplement that was published as a poster, not a full study, funded by the supplement company. And the multi-ingredient formula had 3 other things that can positively impact the outcome. So there's really no data to suggest that. No mechanistic reason, there's no reason to think it would be the case, and no data to support it that is trustworthy or not, or doesn't have covariates. So Yeah, unless someone just really doesn't like having as much money as they have. I'd say just, get whey and then donate it to somewhere.
Yeah.
But if you're a vegan, then yeah, like pea protein is not fast digesting. Neither is rice, compared to whey at least. So it probably makes more sense to do something like essential amino acids. But yeah, I think you could also just have half a banana and then have pea protein when you finish training.
Yeah.
So it's a tough one. I think the economical consideration is something that is the individual can decide, but it's hard for me to think of a scenario where essential amino acids would be better.
I love that way of thinking, though. It's not just looking at something for what's the one outcome that I'm going to get from taking this BCAA? Is it going to make me jacked or save my muscle or whatever? It's like, no, what about the drawback on your bank account? Like, what about there's other aspects, there's other facets to look at than just what the marketing says about the supplement,
Yep.
That's awesome. So I do want to sort of finish up this episode, Eric, with a little bit of a chat around health and the potential maybe drawbacks of really high protein intake. Even what we've talked about today of 1.6 to 2.2 is the standard sort of approach for someone who wanted to gain muscle. All the clients, majority of the clients I work with, we're trying to put on muscle mass and lose body fat, or either one of the two. And like I mentioned to you, I don't want to be telling them to eat a stack load of protein just to say 20, 30, 40 years down the track have them and some other data come out around, hey, there has been correlation between cardiovascular disease and excess protein intake, or certain types of cancer and excess protein intake, whether it's plant-based or not. And I think especially within the plant-based community, there's a lot of plant-based MDs that throw around some research around, hey, there's a cascade of events from having high protein intake and how that affects IGF-1, how that affects mTOR, how leucine affects these things, and then how that then is correlated with certain types of disease risk factors. And yeah, I would love to hear if you've got some insight on that, or you've seen research on it yourself. I know, like we discussed, it's not completely your wheelhouse, but whatever you've got to say, I think the people would love to hear.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is something I've definitely looked at, but it's something that I'm not an expert in. So if we wanted to get into the mechanisms, like how actually does that mTOR pathway or the influence of IGF-1 lead to cancer, I'd basically say, if it hypertrophy muscles, it could also have an influence on hypertrophying tumors, but I don't know. I think overall being in a nutrient surplus tends to be not good if you have an existing tumor. I mean, it just kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
It's tissue that grows, right? But the actual mechanisms, not one to speak to it. Where I do fashion myself knowledgeable is in applied outcomes, which is really what we need to care about. What are the actual odds ratios when we look at these studies, and what is being controlled for, and what are the limitations of these studies? That's how we make the best decision we can, because we're probably not going to have multi-year long RCTs, a randomized controlled trial, where we can establish causation and give, let's say one group at 2.2 grams per kg of protein, another group at 1.2 grams per kg of protein, and then actually have two other groups, and one is getting that from, let's say, whey or chicken or animal-based sources, and the other group is getting it from pea protein or rice, etc. And then you'd also have to think about everything else they're doing needs to be matched. So that RCT would need to be requiring them to be all the other lifestyle factors that influence disease risk and all-cause mortality to be the same. So you'd have to randomize them and put them on this diet. And then it would need to be just the protein aspect of it, not just one's on a vegetarian diet, 1.6 to 2.2, and one's not. Because then could be differences in their fruit and vegetable content.
Right, yeah.
Right? So there's a number of ways to tackle this from that kind of applied outcomes perspective. And this is where I'm going to whip my notes out to make sure I get the data right. So one of the biggest things I talked about earlier, when I'm helping someone decide or be better informed regarding their decision to be vegetarian, if they are doing it for health reasons, I normally want them to understand that on balance, the health aspect of vegetarian diets are the high inclusion of fruits and vegetables rather than the exclusion of animal products.
Right.
So there is a ton of data where if you take a vegetarian and you compare them to someone else in the population, you see lower all-cause mortality in vegetarians. But you have to realize, what are the covariates? Someone who pays that much attention to their diet is less likely to smoke, less likely to drink in excess, more likely to exercise, and typically has a lower BMI. All of those things are independent risk factors on mortality. So when you start to compare comparable omnivores to comparable vegetarians, these disappearances go away. And I mentioned earlier how a meta-analysis is typically the tippity top of our evidence hierarchy. I would say in reality, a 10,000 person trial would be even better, because then we don't have to deal with heterogeneity between studies. It's just we don't have those studies in this world of sports science. We do have them in the world of health. So, for example, there are some classic studies, the Oxford Vegetarian Study, the Health and Food Shoppers Study, the Oxford EPIC Cohort, the German Vegetarian Studies, when we've got anywhere from 1,900 to 56,000 people. And the odds ratios are right in the middle. They're basically an odds ratio. The way it works, if it's 1.1 in favor of vegetarians, that means they have a 10%, like 1.1. 1 is 100% same. Okay. 10% higher rate of dying. So the odds ratios were like 1.01, 1.03, 1.05 towards vegetarians having a higher mortality, with the confidence interval crossing the zero line. So it's basically no difference we can detect at all. Yeah. The only time there's been a large cohort study that has found a difference, the difference is very small, so an average of 0.88 and 0.85, so 12 or 15% on average less likelihood of dying, and that was in the Adventist study. So the thing about the Adventist study, there are some other covariates there. They are vegetarian for religious reasons, and something that you have to consider is that someone who is not adhering to their religion, they may not be representative of the group they're being compared to, the Adventists who are better vegetarians, because they're seeing themselves as less adherent to their religious practices and guidelines. So that could have some stress causes. That could cause, social dissent in their community. That could cause shame. That could cause a lot of things. So I think it's, when you look at the data out, so that's a question mark I have for that. The other data, I think overall, even worst case scenario, let's say the Adventist study is correct. A 0.88 odds ratio is not that much different. That 12% sounds scary, but if it's only like 1 out of a million die for cardiovascular events, before the age of 50 or something like that, I'm making this up, then it would be 1.12 people dying per million, Right. So that's one way to look at it. So that's overall vegetarian diets. If we want to isolate it to protein, there are 2 other studies that look at outcomes that have been recently published that I think are interesting, and I kind of illustrate the same point of, hey, vegetables are good, animal products aren't necessarily bad, unless maybe they're highly processed. There's some data to suggest that. So there's a study that came out, I believe 2017, and the lead author was Song, and they did find that animal protein was, again, small odds ratio. I think we're talking 1 to 16% higher rates of mortality, and it correlated to higher protein intakes from animal sources. Right. However, it was only present in people with one other risk factor, meaning they had to either also be a smoker or also have a higher BMI or something like that. So right. The point being, I think sometimes we think of it as just the sum of all parts, but the reality is that when you're exercising, when you have good metabolic health, it's not just that that's a tick in the box of having good health. It's actually expanding what could be considered optimally healthy for you, because you're better able to handle, dispose of, and deal with, like nutritional toxicants and, nutrient overload and all these things. It's an ironic thing. To give you an example, bodybuilders are always concerned about insulin sensitivity. Am I insulin sensitive, insulin resistant? Should I have a high carb or low carb diet? Dude, you train 6 days a week. You're one of the most insulin sensitive people I know. You're 25. You're 12% body fat when you're not dieting. Like, you could handle. You have the most metabolic flexibility of anyone in this building. Why are you worried about it? Homeboy over there only gets 2,000 steps a day, and he's eating all the fat and all the carbs. Right. So I think we forget that the other things we do outside of our diet gives us more flexibility for what is a healthy diet. And rather than them just being these kind of isolated ticks, they're interdependent variables. So that's a cool study that suggests that, if you're living a healthy life, you've got more flexibility. But it's often like the orthorexic people who are living a healthy life and then are trying to micromanage their diet. And they think, oh my God, do I need to cut out all meat? Probably not. Like, you don't need to worry about this nearly as much as your clients. Yeah. So and then another study that was more recent, and it was I believe in Japanese. It's a Japanese cohort, so there could be some ethnic or ancestral differences that may not apply to Europeans if you're listening to this, or any other ethnic group. But they looked at a cohort of, I think, almost 71,000 Japanese adults, and they followed them for an average of 18 years. So this is a really good, I mean, it's not a controlled trial. It's observational, which is a weakness of all this stuff. For example, some of the earliest studies, and this is a tangent, I'll get back to this study on the Japanese cohort. Some of the earliest studies that correlated protein intake with cardiovascular disease, they were basically correlating meat intake. Because so meat is not just protein. Like if you're eating a bunch of meat, you're also eating a bunch of saturated fats and a bunch of cholesterol. So, and maybe potentially more total calories. Mm-hmm. So what you're looking at is a lot of correlated factors that aren't necessarily causational. The way we should be using these prospective and retrospective epidemiological studies is as hypothesis generating. So then we can look into the individual nutrients. But it's very difficult, like I said, to actually get an RCT. So we shouldn't be making these strong conclusions, but there's also a high risk. Like there's a downside to ignoring them or dismissing them, because again, nobody wants to get cancer. Yeah. But if the effects were so high, it would be more clear in the epidemiological data.
That's right.
We're looking at like the signal to noise ratio, right? So if there was a really, really big signal in the noise, then some of these minor covariates shouldn't be dampening the signal that much.
Right.
So I think
that's a good point.
So I think that's something to consider. So anyway, getting back to this Japanese cohort, there are 71,000 people, and they did find that, and again, we're talking small hazard ratios, like an 11% difference or something like that. They did find that indeed there was a lower risk of cardiovascular disease mortality associated with higher plant protein intake, but there wasn't a higher risk associated with more animal protein. So it basically found the same thing, that if you're going to consume a bunch of animal proteins, that's not harmful, but consuming a lot of vegetable proteins, and therefore, by definition, vegetables, that actually improves your health. So that means, from if we were to get that level of granularity, which I think is really helpful, it's not either or. You can have an omnivorous diet that includes meat that's very high vegetable intake, but it's still high in a protein intake overall. And you would think that you would probably get some of those benefits. Because when you're measuring vegetable proteins, by proxy, you're measuring vegetables too in the diet, right? So I think overall what I would say is that while there are mechanisms by which a high protein diet could have some influence on cancer risk, it doesn't show up in all-cause mortality risk when you compare just vegetarians to comparable omnivores. And when you break it down based on animal proteins to vegetable proteins in and of themselves, it's modified by what else do you do with your life. And at least in this really large cohort of Japanese individuals, it seemed that plants were protective, animal proteins weren't bad. So you don't need to be fearful when you have a chicken breast that one time at a friend's house and you didn't want to say no to his mom.
Right.
But just feel good about the fact that you have a plant-based diet, whether it includes meat or not. But don't worry so much about the meat if everything else is in place.
No, I love it, man. I think for the listeners of this podcast specifically, they're not going to have to really worry so much about their high pea and rice protein blend diet, that that they're not going to run into the issues with cancer and cardiovascular disease down the track. But it is, it's a highly debated topic, and people love to, I guess, sensationalize it a lot, especially with films like What the Health and things like that. I guess love to bank on fear as a driving factor behind diet change and things like that.
If I can say one thing on that.
I'd love it.
I think understanding what the scientific process is inherently will really help people assess whether is what they're watching valid or more likely to be valid. It's really clear if you watch most of these documentaries that the people go in with, here's what's going on, but I need to find all the evidence, right? These vegetarians are doing well. I think this meat's not good. I need to find like the clues that show this to be the case. Why is this happening? Not, is this happening? Right. So a scientist, if they're doing their job right, he or she is going to be going, okay, I'm going to collect all the evidence on a given topic. I might have a hypothesis, but I'm looking to confirm or deny it. And then based on the data, I'm going to form a conclusion. Most of these films, it's really obvious if you watch it. They start with the conclusion and then they look for the evidence.
Yeah.
You know, and that it's really easy to do to support your bias. So ask yourself that question next time you watch a Netflix documentary. Did they go into it with a blank slate, or did they go into it with looking for evidence for something they already believed?
No, that's a really good point. I guess from the producer director point of view, do you think they can, like, have you watched the documentary yourself where they can go in with a completely blank slate and not have any bias? Or is that just a nature of documentaries in itself because they're trying to portray a specific topic?
Yeah, I mean, if I was to put this kind of tongue-in-cheek, you have the option to go on an open access journal, or you can go the same place where you watch Thor fight Hulk to get your nutrition information.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, how do you expect it to be unbiased when it is for the purpose of entertainment?
Yeah.
Like, Netflix gets paid based on watches, views, shares, likes, and whether you are entertained. You know, they are kicking people into holes and saying, "Are you not entertained?" This is, this is Sparta. This is the gladiatorial combat between nutrition. You know, it's not their purpose is not to find out the actual hazard ratios, control for covariates, and provide something that might inform, policy or coaches or evidence-based practitioners. So, I mean, I'm not mad at the documentaries. I'm kind of annoyed that people think that documentaries are the place to get the highest quality of evidence.
That's right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's I mean, definitely even in the last year, Game Changers coming out, and that they sparked a whole new set of discussions around plant-based nutrition. I think a lot of it is probably positive discussions as well, though, that people are starting to think about their food choices, and possibly, even though it was centered around performance, and I have my issues with the film's conclusions around that, but at the same time, I'm seeing a lot of people starting to reduce animal products from factory farming, and from an ethical perspective, I think there's some huge positive for them doing that, whether they know the truth about its benefits on performance or health or not. Yeah,
and if I may, I think this is one of those times where we need to be aware that a means to an end philosophy has limits. So this is basically the crux of like the utilitarian perspective on ethics. Like, if it results in an outcome that is net positive, then what got you there is not as important. Right. And I think that there are issues with that when you apply it to the truth. Because then people create false fears, false beliefs, and they operate in a different way that can have second, third, fourth order effects. So, like, I think the way people judge Game Changers, if they are already vegetarian, vegan, and well-informed, is like, well, you know what? Ethically, environmentally, and in terms of overall health, I think it's better if people are plant-based. And those things might be true. You could at least make an argument for them to be true. You're going to be contributing to less animal suffering. You will probably have total lower carbon footprint from the decisions you make. And if you consume a whole bunch of vegetables, you're probably going to be healthier.
Yeah.
That's all true. But if it's based on the belief that there is a government conspiracy or crony capitalism to sell you food products that are harmful, much in the same way the cigarette industry did in the earlier part of the last century, that also has the effects of now you're going to distrust doctors, policymakers. You're going to be bought into more conspiracy theories. You're weakening your own ability to be critical. So you have to think about, like, I personally think that you really have to consider the means. You never want to sacrifice the truth in your means to get to an outcome that you believe in, or you end up in the same place as American politics.
Right.
Where the left and the right purposely misrepresent one another because they're in a culture war.
Yeah.
And you don't want a culture war in a supposed democracy, because the democracy is founded on the idea that we're going to come together to compromise to find the society that best represents everyone as best as we can.
Yeah.
But if the other side is trying to beat the other side, that means that the a priori assumption is the way we win is with half the country unhappy. And that doesn't lead to a good society, as we're currently seeing in the world. So I think we need to take that same attitude. Like, absolutely, utilitarian perspectives can be very useful from like a coaching perspective. Like, hey, whatever I can get you to do to result in your health being better, there's value in that. But we don't want to have people sacrifice the truth for that. Or we can run into the problems. You know, like, yeah, you're eating less, you're eating healthier, but you were afraid of consuming animal products and you develop an eating disorder.
Yeah.
You know, you went to a friend's party, you binged, you had some ribs, and then you threw up in the bathroom.
Yeah.
Because of this. And then
100%.
maybe an underlying, kind of perfectionistic, obsessive, mentality. So I think we have to be very careful with the ripple effects of going, well, in the end, at least they're eating more than online, I believe.
Yeah. No, it's so good, Eric, because I think we can always count on you to jump a couple of layers deeper, break things down, and it's good. It's why one of the reasons I listen to you so much and whatever topic you're talking about, because I can look at my own. And again, this is very current with what's going on now in the world. I can look at my own sort of systemic beliefs that I've grown up with and then sort of, pull back the layers, another layer at a time. And just like we've been discussing in regards to, watching documentaries and things like that. So, it's always quality discussions, man. So appreciate you coming on and chatting about that.
My pleasure.
Wrapping up, man, what does the rest of 2020 look like for you? Obviously, not a lot of travel going on. We know that usually you're traveling around the world doing seminars and things like that. What have you got going on?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's awesome that we have hit level 1 here in New Zealand. For anyone who's outside of New Zealand, that means do we still have one case? Is there still someone in recovery?
I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's done.
So this person, the one person who had the case, hopefully is still alive. I haven't looked at it. But he's either has completely recovered. So we've actually reached eradication in New Zealand, which is awesome. And I think there is kudos to be said to the folks who did their job in being quick to act while they watched the rest of the world shit the bed.
Crumble, yeah.
And which is unfortunate. I don't mean that as derisive. Not a lot of people had a lot of agency in that. That was some decisions at the top. But and people followed the rules sufficiently for us to reach that point. So I think we can pat ourselves on the back. But unfortunately, the borders are still closed. So maybe we're going to get that Trans-Tasman bubble going, and I could do something with the JPS.
I hope we do. Yeah, because I'm hanging out to get back there. Yeah.
Alex Thomas, and there's some folks who it could manifest in something across the pond. But right now, I mean, I'm probably just going to be lifting weights and going to AUT and doing stuff like this. So
I like it.
And I'm fine with that. I've actually been really enjoying getting more time to focus on being an athlete, and spend more time with my wife and my cats. So
yeah, good. And your training is looking like a little more weightlifting at this stage.
Yeah, that has changed too. That's a good. So I was all about trying to do the trifecta this year and compete in strongman, weightlifting, and powerlifting in the same year and improve in them all. And I thought that'd be a really cool programming challenge. And then during lockdown, I only had access to 90 kilos in a bar, no squat rack or no bench. So essentially, it was just focusing on my snatch. And initially I had some elements of extrinsic motivation of I want to improve my total in weightlifting and powerlifting, and I want to do the Auckland Strongman competition and see how I go and balance all that and not get hurt. That was my goals.
Yeah.
And then I found myself, and that was what motivated me, but because I just stopped thinking about any competition because I had no idea how long we were going to be in lockdown. And then the zombie apocalypse is happening. So I'm like, all right, why do I train? I train because I love it. What can I focus on right now? What do I have agency over? It's snatch specialization time. And then I got really, really interested in trying to make my snatch look like a snatch and maybe earn the title of a weightlifter, instead of someone who dabbles, right?
Yeah.
Even though I don't dabble, I try really hard. It just looks like I dabble.
Yeah, for sure.
So once we came out of lockdown, the schedule shifted, so there were some logistic issues, but I just couldn't find the same motivation to try to do all three. So now I'm probably looking at doing OWNZ Masters Nationals in October, which is going to be in Auckland. And I need to post a qualifying total before that, which is just a total for masters.
Oh, cool. No, there's no requirement for it.
No, it is hilarious that I'm competing in the masters because powerlifting is 40 and over, but weightlifting, because you get slow earlier, it's 35.
Wow, really? Your master's at 35?
Yeah, so now Jeff and Brad, who I normally make fun of for being older,
make
fun of me, so it's good times. So anyway, so weightlifting is going to be the main focus. Of course, it's easy to incorporate global bodybuilding stuff with that.
Yep.
It's not like I'm not going to do curls or lateral raises or calf raises or hamstring curl or whatever. But and I don't think my squat or my deadlift are going to go down getting stronger in Olympic weightlifting. Yeah. So if I want to do a powerlifting meet towards the end of the year, I might, Auckland Cup, and I'll just run a bench specialization cycle last minute.
Great.
So, but probably just a weightlifting, possibly weightlifting with the powerlifting meet at the end.
Do you see yourself, depending on how the whole world situation goes on, do you see yourself trying for that sort of trifecta next year, 2021? Is that something you still want to do?
It's definitely on the bucket list.
Yeah.
I would love to. So that would be, unless I just, if maybe weightlifting really starts to go really well, or it goes really bad, then it might just be strongman powerlifting. So I
think for a lot of people, it just blows their mind that you are able to try and even program for all three components. It takes a bit of juggling, I'm sure.
You got to find the overlap.
Yeah.
So you have to figure out how can the powerlifting support my strongman, and then what overhead work do I want to do that is going to support my clean and jerk, and then figure out what's the kind of the minimum effect of a dose to improve in any given one, and the one that requires the highest dose, that's where you put more energy. And then you do it phasically, like, all right, how do I just maintain on these two and then improve on the one that's 6 weeks from now? What's the minimum dose I have to maintain, not even improve? So that's kind of the calculus that you have to do, and then don't get hurt.
Which is the much harder one. Absolutely. Good stuff, man. So I have one last question for you, Eric. And I put this up on a story recently on Instagram, and I don't know. Where did I hear this? I heard this question somewhere. I thought it was a great question to ask people. So, seeing as you're a bit of a thinker and you've probably had some good experiences in your life, and you've done a lot of travel. What is one eye-opening experience that every human should have? And this is obviously from your own perspective. So,
I think one eye-opening experience any human should have would be experiencing unconditional acceptance and love from someone who is from a totally different background than you, so that you can kind of see the shared humanity we have.
Yeah.
So that's something I've been very fortunate to have in my life at different times from different people.
Yep.
And it's quite literally from picking heavy shit up off the ground, And I can think of a few scenarios where something you wouldn't expect brought me into intersection with someone who became a deep, close, lifelong friend of mine, but we come from very different backgrounds.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, there you go. That sort of pursuing the iron still, brings about other outcomes rather than just changing your body or getting strong and a bench press. I love that, man. That's super cool.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, it's cool to see everyone's got like such a different answer to that question, and based on their own experiences through their life, and so it's super cool to hear your perspective on that as well.
Cheers.
But thanks, man, for coming out today. Appreciate you coming over from the other side of Auckland and having a chat and breaking down the protein for us. I think the listeners are going to love this. I think they're going to, it's going to be a deep discussion for them to listen to. And we've been sort of trying to cover some of those topics. Like we covered hypertrophy training with Jacob, and covering protein with yourself, and we'll be diving into some other topics in the future. But yeah, it's always good to have someone who is in the research themselves and a science communicator like yourself to break it down for people, and also have some good nuanced discussion around certain things as well. So thanks for coming out.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, appreciate it. How good. To be honest, I don't have too much to add to that mammoth of an episode. Guys, I hope you can tell from Eric's manner, how he talks, that he is a very, very intellectual individual and one of the most rational guys out there. So be sure to go and follow that guy and, pick up on some of the stuff he is putting down. I think it comes down to simplicity, guys. So you can see throughout that episode, he's going into the research and breaking it down. But when it comes down to it, a lot of discussions that we get into these heated debates over the amount of protein we need to have, the timing of protein, whether we should have protein before training or after training, all these things, it doesn't actually matter too much in the long run. A lot of those studies ended up having similar results, even with vastly different, protein timings or meal spacings or whatever the case may be. I think when we come down to simplicity and look at our training, we're making sure we're getting the big rocks in place, and then with our nutrition, getting the big rocks in place. When it comes to protein, it's a case of, hey, are we getting enough for whatever goal it may be that you have, whether it's health, obviously a lower amount if you're just going for health, or whether it's muscle gain or strength gain or body recomposition. Obviously, the amount is going to change slightly between those different goals. However, once you've got that sort of total amount of protein sorted and you're getting it from quality sources as best as possible, most of the other stuff is, it's kind of that extra sort of 10-20% of the equation, whereas you got 80-90% of the results from getting the total intake in. So don't overcomplicate it. Do the basic stuff, make it a habit, make it a lifelong sustainable behavior that you can keep doing. And guys, lastly, the best thing you can do for this episode, I want this to reach as many people as possible because I think it's such a valid conversation and we get asked this question all the time. So do me a favor, share this on your story on Instagram if you're on the gram, or share it with a friend on Facebook or whatever it may be. But just share it with someone that you think might be interested in this discussion. I think this is one that you should get out there and get to the masses. So do me a favor, share it, let me know your thoughts, and I will be back here shortly for episode 14. Stay well, team, train hard, and more plants.